On a foggy night, the sound of drums echoed through the empty streets. At first, it seemed like a festival had begun, but no one in the town had planned one. That's how it started. That's the thought that sticks with me, the simple, logical thought before logic itself was peeled away from the world. My name is, well, I suppose that part doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the town. The town of Gloomhaven. I found it by accident, a detour on a long cross-country drive. My GPS had flickered and died, and a hand-painted wooden sign, slick with rain and moss, was the only guide I had. Gloomhaven. The name should have been a warning. It sounded like something from a forgotten storybook, a place where the sun was always shy. The fog was thick, a heavy white blanket that swallowed the sound of my engine. The town was silent. Not quiet, like a sleeping suburb, but silent, like a tomb. The houses were old, with sharp, pointed roofs that looked like teeth against the gray sky. Porch lights were on, casting weak, yellow circles in the mist, but no one was home. Or at least, no one was visible. I felt 1,000 eyes on me from behind dark windows. I was tired, my own eyes burning from hours of staring at the road. All I wanted was a bed. I found a single inn at the center of the small, cobblestone town square. It was called The Watcher's Rest. A single light burned above the door. I parked my car, the only car on the entire street, and the silence that rushed in when I killed the engine was absolute. It pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. The man at the front desk was named Silas. He was a statue carved from old wood and regret. His skin was the color of faded paper, and his eyes were 2 chips of gray stone. He didn't smile when I came in. He didn't seem surprised to see a stranger. He just watched me, his hands resting flat on the worn-out wooden counter. "Need a room?" I said, my voice sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. He nodded slowly, a creak in his neck. "Just one night?" "Yes, just one night. I'm just passing through." A shadow of something I couldn't name passed over his face. It wasn't amusement, not quite. It was closer to pity. "Everyone is just passing through," he whispered, his voice like the rustle of dead leaves. He pushed a heavy, iron key across the counter. "Room 7. Top of the stairs." As I took the key, his cold, dry fingers brushed against mine. He leaned forward slightly, and the scent of dust and damp earth filled the air. "Some advice, traveler? Tonight is the annual harvest. Our parade. You'll hear it. When you do, go to your window. You must watch. It is very important that you watch." I must have looked confused. "A parade? At this time of night?" He ignored my question. "There are rules. Keep your light off. Make no sound. Not a gasp, not a whisper. And this is the most important rule of all. Show nothing on your face. No fear. No sadness. No joy. No surprise. Become like stone. Watch the parade, let it pass, and you will see the morning. Do you understand me?" I nodded, though I didn't understand at all. It sounded like some bizarre local custom, a spooky game played for tourists. But there were no other tourists. There was only me. "Okay," I said. "Watch, no sound, no feeling." "Got it." He leaned back, his expression unchanging. "It is not a game," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "It is a toll. And the toll must be paid. Now go to your room. It will be starting soon." My room was clean, but old. The air was cold and smelled of old wood and rain. The window was large, a single pane of glass that looked out over the main street. It was like a theater box, and the town square was the stage. I sat on the edge of the bed, the heavy key cold in my hand. I felt a deep unease, a primal instinct telling me to get back in my car and drive, fog or no fog. But I was so tired. My body ached with exhaustion. A parade. How bad could a small town's night parade be? It was probably just some folk tradition. I would watch for a few minutes and then go to sleep. I was wrong. I was so profoundly, horribly wrong. I lay on the bed for what felt like an hour, drifting in and out of a light, restless sleep. I dreamed of faceless people walking in circles, their feet making no sound on the stones. And then, a sound from the waking world pulled me out of the dream. It was a drum. Thump. A single, deep, resonant beat. It wasn't loud, but it felt like it was inside my chest. It was the sound of a giant's slow, mournful heart. Thump. It was coming from the far end of town, down the fog-shrouded street. I remembered Silas's words. "You must watch." My curiosity, stronger than my fear at that moment, pulled me from the bed. I went to the window, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor. I looked out into the darkness. The street was empty. The fog swirled. And then I saw them. The townspeople. One by one, lights went out in the houses across the street. In the faint glow of the street lamps, I could see figures appearing in their windows. A man in an undershirt. A woman with her hair in a braid. A small child, lifted up to see. Their faces were all the same. Blank. Empty. Their eyes were wide, but they held no expression. They were not people waiting for a festival. They were statues waiting for a storm. Thump. The drum was closer now. And with it came the first sign of movement. At the end of the street, a shape emerged from the fog. It was huge. It was the beginning of the parade. It was the beginning of the harvest. The first float, if you could call it that, was a monument to sorrow. It was a colossal human figure, at least 30 feet tall, made of what looked like cracked gray clay. It was so heavy it had to be dragged on a massive stone sled by dozens of small, hunched figures in gray robes. Their faces, I could see now, were smooth, featureless planes of skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. They pulled in silence, their movements jerky and unnatural. The giant clay man was weeping. It made no sound, but thick, black tears, like oil, oozed from its hollow eye sockets. The tears ran down its cracked cheeks and dripped onto the cobblestones below. When they hit the ground, they didn't splash. They sizzled, and a tiny puff of acrid smoke rose from each one. The smell of wet ashes and ozone drifted up to my window. I felt a powerful wave of sadness wash over me. It was an unnatural, profound grief that didn't feel like my own. It felt like the accumulated sorrow of 1,000 lifetimes, all pouring out of this one clay figure. My throat tightened. I felt my own eyes begin to water. And then, like a splash of ice water, I remembered the rule. Show nothing. I forced my face into a mask. I bit the inside of my cheek hard, the sharp pain a welcome distraction. I stared at the weeping giant, my expression as blank as I could make it. I looked across the street. The family in the window opposite mine was watching, their faces like stone. The little boy, no older than 5, stared with eyes that seemed far too old for his face. No one moved. No one felt. The weeping giant passed by my window, and the wave of sadness receded, leaving me feeling hollowed out and cold. I understood now. This was not a celebration. This was a ritual. The next float was pulled by more of the faceless gray servants. It was a large, flat platform, like a stage. On the stage was a single, impossibly tall and thin creature. It was pale white, with limbs that were too long, bending at angles that were wrong. It had at least a dozen arms, and in each of its long, spider-like hands, it held the strings of a marionette. The marionettes were the size of real people. They wore modern clothes, jeans, sweaters, dresses. They looked disturbingly lifelike. Their faces were painted with wide, bright, grotesque smiles. As the creature wiggled its fingers, the puppets were forced to dance. It was a horrible, jerky parody of joy. Their limbs flailed, their heads lolled, their painted smiles never faltering. I stared at them, a cold dread creeping up my spine. One of the puppets, a man in a business suit, had a small, dark stain on his shirt, right over his heart. Another, a young woman with blonde hair, had a scuff mark on her shoe, the kind you get from stumbling on a curb. They were too detailed. They weren't just puppets. My gaze was drawn to one in particular. A little girl in a red coat. Her puppet strings were tangled, so her dance was even more clumsy and broken than the others. Her head was tilted at an awkward angle. From one of her painted-on eyes, a single, clear drop of water traced a path down her cheek, smudging the paint. It was a real tear. I gasped. It was a tiny sound, barely a breath. But in the crushing silence of the street, it was a thunderclap. Instantly, the parade stopped. The drum went silent. The faceless servants froze. The tall, pale puppeteer stopped moving. All of its arms went still, and the dancing, smiling puppets hung limp and lifeless on their strings. And then, the puppeteer's head, a smooth, white, featureless orb, slowly turned. It swiveled on its long, thin neck, scanning the windows of the houses. It was looking for the source of the sound. It was looking for me. Panic, pure and absolute, seized me. My heart hammered against my ribs. My first instinct was to jump back from the window, to hide in the darkness of the room. But Silas's other warning echoed in my mind. You must watch. To look away was to fail. To hide was to be found. I stood my ground, my body rigid with terror. I forced myself to look directly at the pale, faceless thing. I held my breath. I emptied my mind. I focused on a single crack in the window pane, making it the center of my universe. The featureless face swept across the street, and for a terrifying, eternal moment, it paused on my window. I could feel its attention on me, a cold, clinical pressure against my mind. It was searching, probing. I dated nothing. I was a statue. I was stone. I was a part of the silent, watching town. After what felt like an eternity, the puppeteers had slowly turned back to the street. The deep thump of the drum started again. The gray servants resumed their pulling. The puppets began their hideous, joyful dance once more. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. My legs were shaking so violently I had to grip the windowsill to stay upright. I had passed the test, but I knew with a chilling certainty that I was not safe. The parade was still coming, and it was testing us. It was hunting for any flicker of life, any spark of emotion in the darkness. I couldn't leave the window now. I was a prisoner, bound by fear and by the unwritten laws of this nightmare place. I looked across the street again. In another window, an old woman was watching. Her face was blank, but her hands, resting on her windowsill, were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. She was fighting it, just like me. How many years had she stood at this window, watching this procession, turning herself to stone to survive the night? The parade continued, a procession of allegories torn from a madman's dream. There was a float carrying a giant, intricate cage made of twisted, rusted metal. Inside the cage, there was nothing but shadows. But the shadows moved, writhing and twisting like living things. And from them came whispers. Faint at first, then growing louder as the cage drew near. They weren't speaking words, but fragments of them. Names of people long dead, half-forgotten regrets, the beginnings of promises that were never kept. The whispers tried to hook into my mind, to find a memory to latch onto. I heard my grandmother's name, whispered in a voice that was almost, but not quite, hers. I shut it out, focusing on the rhythmic thump of the drum, letting it be the only thing I heard. Next came the clockwork man. He was a brass automaton sitting on a throne of gears and cogs. His entire body was a maze of whirring machinery. His eyes were two clock faces, their hands spinning backward at an incredible speed. The sound he made was deafening, 1,000 clocks ticking out of sync, a chaotic symphony of stolen seconds. As he passed, I felt a strange sense of vertigo, as if my own personal timeline was being unspooled. The memory of my breakfast that morning felt as distant as a childhood dream. He was not just a machine. He was a thief of time, and every tick of his body was a moment stolen from the world. Then came the float that truly terrified me. It was carried by 4 of the gray servants, and on it stood a row of tall, ornate mirrors. Their frames were carved with images of screaming faces and grasping hands. But they didn't reflect the empty street or the houses opposite. They reflected the watcher. As the mirrors passed before the house next to mine, I saw the reflection of the man in the window. But it wasn't him. The man at the window was still and blank-faced. The reflection, however, was contorted in agony, its mouth wide in a silent scream, its hands beating against the inside of the glass. The mirror was showing the truth. It was reflecting the terror he was hiding inside. The mirrors moved slowly, inexorably, towards my window. I knew what I would see. I would see my own face screaming. I would see the panic I was desperately trying to crush. And what would happen then? Would the reflection step out of the mirror? Would it betray me to the things in the street? I braced myself. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. The mirror drew level with my window. I looked. I saw my reflection. It was pale, my eyes were wide, but my face was a mask of calm. My expression was blank. But the reflection's eyes, they were not my own. They were filled with a cold, ancient intelligence. And as I stared, my reflection slowly, deliberately, raised one hand and pressed its palm against the glass from the inside. It wasn't screaming. It was watching me, judging me. And then it smiled. A slow, thin, cruel smile that did not touch its eyes. The mirror moved on. The smile from my reflection was burned into my mind. It was as if the parade was showing me what I would become if I stayed here. Another empty watcher, with something cold and terrible hiding behind the mask. I noticed something else then. The townspeople. They weren't just watching. They were being judged. In a window down the street, a teenage boy was watching with his family. As the float with the cage of whispers passed him, he flinched. A barely perceptible movement. a slight tightening of his jaw. He must have heard a name that meant something to him. It was enough. From the cage, a single, long tendril of shadow lashed out. It moved with impossible speed, silent and thin as a wire. It didn't break the window. It phased through it as if the glass wasn't there. The boy's parents, standing on either side of him, didn't move. They didn't even blink. Their faces remained utterly blank. The shadow tendril touched the boy's forehead for a single second. The boy's body went rigid. The flicker of emotion, the tiny spark of recognition that had given him away, was extinguished. His face went slack, settling into the same empty, placid mask as his parents'. The light in his eyes simply went out. He was still standing, still watching, but he was gone. The part of him that remembered, the part that could feel, had been harvested. The shadow tendril retracted back into the cage. The parade moved on. I finally understood. This was the toll Silas had spoken of. The parade fed on emotion. It fed on memory. It fed on the very essence of what made a person human. The people of Gloomhaven were not just emotionless. They were empty. They had been paying this toll for years, for generations, giving up pieces of themselves one by one until there was nothing left but a hollow shell that knew only how to stand at a window and watch. My exhaustion was gone, replaced by a sharp, cold, adrenaline-fueled terror. This wasn't about surviving the night. It was about surviving with my soul intact. I had to get through this. I had to remember every rule. I had to become nothing until the sun rose. The drumbeat changed. It slowed down, each beat becoming deeper, more powerful. Thump. It shook the glass in my window. Thump. It vibrated to the floor, up my legs, and into my bones. All the other sounds of the parade, the whispers, the ticking, the sizzle of tears, faded away into nothing. There was only the drum. And then I saw him. The Grand Marshal. The conductor of this silent orchestra. He didn't ride a float. He rode a throne. A massive, jagged throne carved from a single piece of black, light-absorbing rock. It was pulled not by the gray servants, but by 6 enormous, shadowy beasts that looked like wolves made of smoke and fear, their eyes glowing with a faint, red light. The Grand Marshal himself was tall and regal, dressed in a long coat the color of a starless midnight sky. He sat perfectly still on his throne. His head was crowned with 2 long, gracefully curved horns that seemed to tear at the fog. But his face, he had no face. Where a face should be, there was only a smooth, perfect, light-devouring void. It was a hole in the shape of a face, a patch of pure nothingness that seemed to warp the air around it. Looking at it made my eyes hurt. It was like staring into the abyss, and the abyss was wearing a crown. In one hand, he held a long, black staff. In the other, he held up a small, old-fashioned lantern. But the lantern didn't contain a flame. It contained a swirling, shimmering ball of faint, milky white light. It was beautiful and terrible all at once. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, what I was looking at. It was the harvest. It was all the stolen emotions, the stolen memories, the stolen souls of the people of Gloomhaven, all collected in one small, glowing sphere. As the throne passed by the houses, the Grand Marshal would occasionally gesture with his free hand towards a window. He pointed at the old woman with the white knuckled fists. She just stared back, her face empty. He was acknowledging her. He knew she was still fighting, that she still had something left to give. He was marking her for a future harvest. The throne kept moving, a slow, unstoppable glacier of darkness. And then it stopped. It stopped directly in front of my inn, directly below my window. The 6 shadow beasts snarled without making a sound, their red eyes fixed on me. The drum went silent. The world went silent. The only sound was the frantic, panic drumming of my own heart, which I was sure the entire town could hear. The Grand Marshal, the conductor of silence, the king of nothing, slowly tilted his faceless head up. The void that was his face was pointed directly at me. I felt the pressure in my mind, a physical weight. It was not a casual glance. It was an inspection. It was peeling back the layers of my consciousness, digging through my thoughts, my memories, my very being. It was searching for the fear that I was so desperately trying to hide. And I was a fountain of fear. I was drowning in it. I did the only thing I could. I focused all my will, all my concentration on my own mask. I did not think about the creature below me. I did not think about the parade. I did not think about my terror. I thought about a brick wall. I built it in my mind brick by brick. A solid, blank, unfeeling wall. It was all I was. Nothing could get in. Nothing could get out. The pressure intensified. It felt like a physical hand was squeezing my brain. The entity in the street was not pleased. It was used to the passive, empty shells of the town. I was different. I was new. I was full. And I was resisting. The void face seemed to narrow, to focus. And then it attacked. It didn't use a tendril of shadow. It used my own mind against me. Suddenly, I wasn't in the hotel room anymore. I was on a warm, sunny beach. My mother was there. She was younger, her face unlined by worry. She was smiling at me, her arms open for a hug. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice a perfect memory. "You're safe now. It's all over." I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. The joy of seeing her, the feeling of safety, it was overwhelming. I took a step towards her. This was the emotion it wanted. It wanted my love, my relief, my joy. It wanted to harvest it. But a part of my mind, the cold, terrified part, screamed a warning. "It's a trick. It's not real. Show nothing." With more strength than I knew I possessed, I pushed the vision away. I tore down the image of my mother's smiling face. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. The beach dissolved back into the cold, dark street. The Grand Marshal was still there, watching, waiting. It tried again. This time, it showed me my greatest failure. A moment from my past I was deeply ashamed of. The shame and regret it produced was a bitter, potent thing. It wanted that too. It fed on all emotions, good or bad. I fought it back, building my mental wall higher and stronger. Brick by brick. Blank. Empty. Stone. The pressure became unbearable. I felt a sharp, pulling sensation, as if a hook had been lodged in the very center of my being. It had stopped trying to trick me into feeling. Now, it was just trying to take something by force. It was pulling at a memory. A specific one. The memory of my first childhood friend, of us laughing on a swing set. It was a simple, happy memory. And it was being torn out of me. I held on. I wrapped my entire consciousness around that single, simple memory. I would not let it go. It was mine. This faceless thing in the street could not have it. The fight was silent, invisible, but it was the most violent struggle of my life. I was fighting for my own past, for my own identity. My body was shaking, sweat was pouring down my face, but my expression in the window remained a perfect, blank slate. And then, something changed. The pulling sensation lessened. The Grand Marshal seemed to pause. It was as if it was considering me. This creature, this ancient collector of souls, had encountered something it did not expect, defiance. A will as strong as its own. For a long, silent moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Me, a tired traveler in a rented room, and it, an ageless horror on a throne of darkness. We were locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, with a movement so slow it was almost imperceptible, the Grand Marshal lowered its hand. The pressure in my mind vanished. The hook was gone. It had let me go. It had decided that the effort of taking from me was not worth the reward. Or perhaps it was intrigued. I will never know. The Grand Marshal gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of approval. It was a nod of acknowledgement. And then the deep drumbeat started again. Thump. The shadow beasts began to pull the throne. The parade moved on. I watched it go, my body so weak with relief that I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, my back against the window. I did not take my eyes off the street. I watched as the rest of the procession passed. It was shorter now. The last float was a small, simple wooden cart. On it sat a single, unlit candle in a plain brass holder. It felt like a final, cruel joke. A symbol of a hope that was never allowed to burn. When the last of the gray servants had disappeared into the fog at the other end of town, and the final, faint thump of the drum had faded into nothing, the silence that returned was different. It was no longer threatening. It was just empty. The show was over. The harvest was done for another year. I stayed on the floor by the window for the rest of the night, too terrified to move, too drained to sleep. I watched the fog swirl and thin. And finally, like a prayer being answered, the first, faint, gray light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. As the sun rose, the town of Gloomhaven woke up. Doors opened. People emerged from their homes. They began their daily routines. They swept their porches. They walked towards the town square. They did it all in that same, crushing silence. They moved like puppets whose strings had been cut, going through the motions of a life they no longer truly lived. They didn't look at each other. They didn't speak. Their faces were as blank in the morning sun as they had been in the moonlight. I had survived the night, but they were trapped in it forever. I didn't wait to check out. I didn't want to see Silas's stony face again. I grabbed my bag, left the iron key on the bed, and ran from the inn. The morning air was cold and clean, but it still felt heavy, like it was clinging to me. I got in my car, my hands shaking so much it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roaring to life was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I drove. I didn't look back. I sped through the empty streets, past the blank-faced people who didn't even turn to watch me go. I followed the road out of town, and as I passed the old wooden sign for Gloomhaven, it felt like I was breaking through a physical barrier. The air in my car suddenly seemed lighter, cleaner. The fog was gone. The sun was bright. It was as if the town didn't exist in the real world, only in its own private bubble of mist and sorrow. Hours later, I was on a busy highway. The world was loud and alive with the sounds of trucks and cars and radios. It was normal. It was real. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station, the relief so intense it felt like a physical pain. I felt like I had just woken from the most vivid and terrifying nightmare of my life. But it wasn't a nightmare. I know it wasn't. I went inside to pay for gas. The cashier was a cheerful young woman who smiled at me. "That'll be $40, sir," she said. "Can I just get your name for the receipt?" I opened my mouth to answer, and nothing came out. I stood there, my mouth open, a blank space in my mind where my name should be. I could see it on my credit card. I could read the letters, but the connection was gone. I couldn't think it. I couldn't say it. It was a word I no longer knew. The Grand Marshal. The conductor. It didn't take my memory of my mother's smile. It didn't take my fear or my joy. I had fought it, and I had won. But it did not leave empty-handed. It took something else as payment for my defiance. It took the first thing. The foundation of who I was. It took my name. I left that gas station in a daze, the cashier staring at me with concern. That was weeks ago. I am a stranger to myself now. I drift from town to town. I can't stay in one place for too long. Because that's not the worst part. The worst part is the nights. Every night, when the world is quiet and I am alone, I can hear something. It is very faint, very far away. Sometimes I think I'm imagining it. But it's always there. Thump. It's the drum. A single, slow heartbeat. Thump. And every night, it feels just a little bit closer. The parade is over in Gloomhaven. But I think for me, a new one is just beginning. And it is following me. And I fear, with a certainty that leaves no room for doubt, that it is coming to finish the harvest.